Hello, BookTube, and welcome to day 2 of the Reading Rush, formerly known as BookTube-a-thon, an event that I'm taking part in, at least a bit, at least at arm's length, because I really like the prompts. I also like the communal enthusiasm of everybody doing challenges and sprints and whatnot. That's all so much fun. And the prompt for today feels a little bit like cheating on my part. It is to read a book in the same spot the whole time. And as you may have learned from watching this channel, reading is all I do. And I'm not a big fan of moving. It's pouring rain outside today, so the bean isn't seeking to go outside either. So it's not a problem to read a book in one place, the same place, for the whole book from start to finish. In fact, I'm going to hold up 4 books for you because we've been here quite some time. We've been here basically all day. She looks out the window occasionally. She says, it doesn't look that bad. I want to go out and scream at people. But then we get outside, and the ground is wet, and there's still rain coming down, and the answer becomes no. No, I don't want to do that anymore. Let's go back inside. She's still a little draggly. I don't know if you could tell on camera. She's still a little bit scraggly, because she does have bodily needs, so she did have to go outside just a bit. Everybody loves you, baby. But I've been watching Reading Rush videos, and I've been loving them. And I've been watching also Vee-Logs. People have been doing Reading Rush Vee-Logs. I've started to figure out, I've asked often on this channel, since I make videos several times every day, I've often wondered if I am a Vee-Logger, and the answer always comes back, no, you're not really. I mean, we want to see you every day, but you're not really a vlogger because you don't move around. The whole point of vlogging is to take the camera with you and go somewhere, but I scarcely ever do that. However, I have come up with a way to incorporate signature action from my day into this Reading Rush Vee-Log. I'm going to move around in a way that I do during the day to show you what my day is like. Are you ready? There you go. Did you catch that? This is when I'm contemplating getting up and then thinking maybe it's not worth it. And then this is when I'm going back to reading. Did you get that? Okay, so I want to show you the books. And we'll start with an old one. Most of what I read these days, 99% of what I read these days, is new releases of some kind or other, even if the new release is an older book. But in this case, I was prodded by a booktuber. Alex, at What Page Are You On? Did a video in which he chronicles a book haul. He does a book haul. He went to Asheville, North Carolina, and stopped in at a whole bunch of bookstores that appeared to be retail. Yes, indie, but still charging full price for a book, so he must have spent $200 on the books that he showed on his channel, which just sent a chill of horror up my spine. And that chill of horror was chased, of course, by a chill of disgust when he held up works by Alice Munro and specifically told his viewers not to pay attention to me when I call her one of the most boring and overrated writers in the history of the English language. My bête noire, one of my bête noirs. Nevertheless, I'm right. And the way that you can tell this is one of the surest ways that I always used to say back in the 70s when the crop of incredibly lauded and genuflected to literary lions was slightly different, but still bankrupt of talent. And that I say the same thing now with people like Alice Munro. She benefits from this mindlessly parroted reputation that she is one of the greatest short story writers of all time. Okay, fine. But if I were to hunt up a short story of hers, one of her 45 pagers about 2 spinster aunts checking train schedules on the kitchen table, if I were to hunt up one of those and take her name off it and give it to you without any indication that she's the one who wrote it. In fact, if I were to tell you, surefire way in 2019, if I were to tell you that this is a new thing, a new short story by an up-and-coming cis white male, and you were to read it, without your goalpost moves, in other words, with complete honesty, without reading into a bandwagon or a reputation, you would say, God Almighty, that was incredibly boring, and the prose is so turgid. Why did you give that to me? How could anybody give this cis white male any money for a book contract? At which point I would say, Jacques Hughes! But nobody's ever going to do that, and none of the people who jump on the Alice Munro bandwagon are ever going to admit that they even know the bandwagon is there, much less that that's what they're doing. But that's okay. That's okay, because one of the other books that he mentioned in that video made up for his recommendation of Alice Munro. He led you astray. If you go to Alice Munro's short stories, they aren't short, and they aren't stories, but if you go to her work and cancel out the bandwagon, cancel out the momentum, oh, Alice Munro, you will find nothing there that is of the slightest bit of interest or that shows the slightest bit of literary skill. And so that misleading is a little troubling. But in the same video, Alex held up The Common Reader by Virginia Woolf, a collection of mostly pieces from the TLS that she did. She was in the early part of the 20th century. She was the greatest writer of her day, one of the greatest writers of the century, but she was a nightmare as a commissioned reviewer. Just a nightmare. Her editor at the TLS knew perfectly well that she was a genius and would give her a book, would say, how about the new biography of Afra Ben? And she would say yes, and a year later she would still claim that she was working on her review. And you couldn't hurry her. And she never quite came out and said it. Her defenders to that editor said, well, on the negative side, you have given her the book and you wanted a review for coverage while the book was still in print, and you're not going to get it because she's taken it into the countryside and claims every time you talk to her that she's still working on it. That's the negative side. On the positive side, when she does write that review, it is going to be immortal. And I'm here to tell you, 99.999% of book reviews are not immortal. And the small solace that the ghost of that editor can have now is that they were right. Of course, they were right. This is an immortal book, and she is one of the greatest writers about books that's ever set pen to paper. And so when I saw Alex, he held up the beautiful new edition of The Common Reader, and then there's a second Common Reader that I assume he either didn't see or didn't want. When I saw that, I had to just pull it out. I have two bookcases of collected book writings and essays, introductions, prefaces, book reviews in the other room. I had to pull down The Common Reader and just restrain myself. I told myself, all right, well, you were prodded by a BookTube video, so you'll just watch one. You'll just read one. So I read her piece on Joseph Addison, and it is just so good. It is just so good. Where she recites first from Lord Macaulay, who wrote a review of Addison and said that he will be loved and revered and read as long as the English language lives. And Virginia Woolf was a very early and a very adamant opponent of what we now call mansplaining. She devised an entire great essay, A Room of One's Own, around a white-hot kernel of rage at being lectured to by men. And she doesn't like it. She doesn't like flat pronouncements from men, especially in the realm of letters. As usual with people who don't like such things, she was not shy about making them herself. But she writes first about Macaulay to demolish his claim, then moves on very steadily to the fact that Addison is not read in 1919 when this essay first appeared. She went to the library and checked. It used to be that you could do that. It used to be that library books had slips on them that showed you the stamped date and time of when they were last checked out. So you could see what kind of a life the book had. I missed that. But she went and did that and saw that barely anybody reads Addison from the library, the public library. She assumed that he lived in private libraries, in brown leather uniform editions, in leafy patios and private libraries. And she might have been right about that in 1919. In 1919, she said that surely someday everywhere in England someone is reading Addison. But if that was true in 1919, that Addison was dying, then the death is accomplished and the coroner has come and gone in 2019. Nobody knows who Addison is. And she puts her finger beautifully on why that would be so. It's an amazing essay where she praises Addison while at the same time digging his grave. It takes an amazing amount of skill to do that. And she puts it so beautifully. She writes, he had a very precise notion of what we are used to call niceness in a man or woman. He was extremely fond of saying that men ought not to be atheists and that women ought not to wear large petticoats. This directly inspires in us not so much a sense of distaste as a sense of difference. Dutifully, if at all, we strain our imaginations to conceive of an audience to whom these precepts were addressed. The Tattler was published in 1709, The Spectator a year or two later. What was the state of England at that particular moment? Why was Addison so anxious to insist upon the necessity of a decent and cheerful religious belief? Why did he so constantly, and in the main kindly, lay stress upon the foibles of women and their reform? Why was he so deeply impressed with the evils of party government? Any historian will explain, but it is always a misfortune to have to call in the services of any historian. A writer should give us a direct certainty. Explanations are so much water poured into the wine. As it is, it's just wonderful. You can hear her saying this. It's uncanny. You can, my inept reading notwithstanding, you can hear her voice in everything that she wrote. It's so incredible. I'm accidentally starting to mimic her diction. As it is, we can only feel that these counsels are addressed to ladies in hoops and gentlemen in wigs, a vanished audience which has learnt its lesson and gone its way, and the preacher with it. We can only smile and marvel and perhaps admire the clothes. And that is not the way to read. To be thinking that dead people deserved these censures and admired this morality, judged the eloquence, which we find so frigid, sublime, the philosophy, to us so superficial, profound, to take a collector's joy in such signs of antiquity, is to treat literature as if it were a broken jar of undeniable age but doubtful beauty, to be stood in a cabinet behind glass doors. And there goes Addison. Just like that. Just like that, he's gone. And yet the essay is beautiful to read, and yet I love reading Addison. I can't thank Alex enough for giving me the nudge, whatever little nudge I ever need to go back to the common reader and just read one essay. I'm going to put it back on the shelf so it doesn't monopolize my day, because I have a lot to do today. It cannot monopolize my day. But I want to show you the newer books that I've read right here in this Vee-Log. The first is a romance, Say No to the Duke, by the great Eloisa James. This is one of the wilds of Lindau Castle that have been, we have covers for them. This is the cover that did it. You can't really make it out in detail, but that's the one that just shot this book, this series. And this the particular wild here is Betsy. She's a wild woman who wants to dress as a man. She wants to dress as a boy and have adventures. And there's a particularly debauched and wicked lord who's perfectly happy to help her do that. And of course, sparks tend to fly between the two of them. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I love all the wild books. I love Eloisa James. She can do no wrong. And the thing I think that keeps me coming back to her romances over and over again, to say the least, we have seen the plot of a young miss who dresses as a boy and encounters romantic adventures before. We've seen that before, and we've also seen what comes later. Two lovers who are perfect for each other and don't see it yet, and so are constantly scheming to get each other married to someone else. We've seen all that before, so you don't go to Regency romances for originality of plot anyway. But the thing that keeps me coming back to Eloisa James is how funny she is. And not just how funny her characters are, it's how funny she is as well. She's perfectly happy as an author, perfectly confident in her ability to hold the reader in her hand. That she is perfectly happy to just swerve out of the way of her main plot for a ridiculous detail that is designed only to make the reader chuckle. And it always works. So I read that. I also read a short but incredibly dense book. I am going to be grappling with this book for a while. It came to me from the folks at Harvard University Press, and at first I didn't think anything of it. I thought, this is just another Trump book. They come in all guises, and I am not tired of them. I am not grousing about that. I am not tired about Trump books. I intend to read them all. It's the least I can do. It's my penance, so you don't have to. But this is not a Trump book. It is so much more than that. It is truly important. And I came to me out of the blue. Didn't know it was coming. Didn't see it in a catalog or didn't remember it. It's by Nadia Urbanati, and it's called Me the People: How Populism transforms democracy. The author is a professor of political science at Columbia University, and this is her study of popularism as opposed to libertarianism, conservatism, even democracy, democratic parties, the political version of democracy. She wants to see what modern populism is separate from all of those things and study it on its own. And at first, when I was reading the book's preface, I thought, okay, well, that's been done many times, but she makes a contention that it's hardly ever been done at all, and the more she lays out her case, the more I saw that she's right. She's making distinctions in this book that are incredibly important to us, because as she points out all throughout the book, the world currently is in the grip of a wave of populism, the like of which it hasn't seen in a century at least. And we all have to grapple with what that means. It's not going anywhere. She writes, there's a phrase that she uses towards the end of the book. What was it? What was the phrase that she uses? Propaganda environment is one of them. But there was another phrase that she uses towards the end of the book. I can't find it, but anyway, the term she uses is that modern-day populism seeks to deconstruct mediation between itself and a populace that it misinforms, that it informs exactly as it wants them to be informed. But it doesn't just, the misinformation isn't the only part. The other part is to deconstruct mediation between any other source of authority and their own. I just thought that was fascinating. Let me read you a bit here. The focus on populist appeal to the many versus the few has dominated the literature on populism. But it is the relationship between populist governments and democratic institutions, especially constitution remaking, that demands attention that has yet largely been overlooked. By inscribing their policy preferences onto the Constitution, populists are able to fuse their party platform with the will of the state. We can give this opportunistic claim a more strategic character and argue that populism aims to create a constitution of its own and eventually build a representative government that reflects the characteristics of its own elected majority. The populist constitution is an entrenched constitution, filled with policy points traditionally left to ordinary legislative processes. As such, the populist constitution seeks to eliminate any distinction between the constitutional and ordinary politics, so critical to the maintenance of democratic order. There's so much in that one paragraph to unpack. I thought it was fantastic. Another point she writes, contemporary populists aim to regain power over the audience, and they profit not only from the decline of traditional mass parties, but also from the technological revolution that has occurred in the domain of information and communication. Just as fascism took advantage of the new media of its own day, particularly radio and movies, populism is taking advantage of television and, even more importantly, the internet. And that her examinations of all aspects of this are just so good. They're just so smart, and with a very serious but not dry prose style. The only major problem that I have with this book that did not get resolved by the end. I'm going to read this again. I didn't get an advanced copy of it, but I'm going to read it again. At least I don't think I got an advanced copy of it. I think this flew under the radar for me. But the only problem that I have with the book, and I had it all the way to the end, I kept expecting it to get resolved, it comes up in that last quote, which is the author seems uninformedly, I can't say uninformedly because she's surely smarter than I am, unaccountably. She seems unaccountably unwilling to equate the populism that she's describing in this book with fascism, even though by far the greatest majority of people who have used the kind of populism that she describes in this book have been fascists. Maybe it's that she resists the fad of fascism is now it and Nazi are the go-to insults now. For people that you don't like, who are expressing opinion you don't like about a comic book. I myself reserve the word for people who walk the walk. If you go to your state-sponsored TV and you talk to one of the talking heads, one of the sycophants on that network, and you mention that when the leader of North Korea, the dictator of North Korea, speaks, his people sit up and listen, and they don't question. And then you say to that anchor, I wish my own people would do the same thing, and you're not joking, you're a fascist. If you have a military parade on a day of civil celebration, if you say that the generals who run your army are your generals, if you say my generals, if you're constantly threatening power, that I don't have to let you do this. I'm letting you do this, but I don't have to. I could simply force myself to do what I want. I have all the power in this equation. I could wipe out 10 million people. I just don't want to. I could. I just don't want to. If you think that way, if you're allowed to speak that way when you're at the head of a government, then you are a fascist. But not everybody's a fascist. It's SJWs who want to make Thor a woman are not fascists. That was the one reservation I had about the book was it sometimes seemed like it didn't want to call a spade when it came to that. It seemed almost like, and I'm sure that this might be the case, that the professor here is trying her best to avoid condemnatory judgments. I think she would rather study this phenomenon than condemn it outright out of hand. And I like that. I like that very much. It enabled me to learn a lot from the book. And I will continue. I will learn more from it because I'm going to reread it. Is Lee in the picture? Oh, there she is. Oh, sorry about that. I didn't even realize that. You want to see her pretty face. And then the book that I'm working on now, and once again, let's vlog. The book that I'm working on now, this comes in very handy. This comes in very handy for reading a really dense section, something that talks about constitutions and democracy. It's really helpful to lay the book down like this and just piece that out. Just sort of piece that out a bit. So there you go. There's more vlogging action for you. Well, the book that I'm working on the most, the one that I'm working on the most, is for a review. I will try to review Me the People. I'm in deep water there, and the author clearly knows the subject better than I ever will, and that's a little dicey for a review. This is the sort of thing that if I were a book section editor for a large journal that paid people a respectable amount of money, I would find an expert to review this thing. I'd find another sociology professor or something like that. But the one that I'm working on the most, right here, read a book in the same spot without moving, is something that I'm going to be reviewing. And I never thought that I would find a venue that would let me review it. I never thought I would. This is Chaim Watzman's translation of Tom Segev's A State at Any Cost, which is his big life of David Ben-Gurion. Big fat thing. And this comes out at the end of August. It was widely read and widely discussed, to put it mildly, to put it very euphemistically, when it came out originally in Israel. And I've been looking forward to it. I have a very old and very dear bookish friend in Tel Aviv who said, I don't know if this is ever going to get translated into English, but if it ever does, you should read it. And I agreed wholeheartedly to, if it ever did. Here it is, just a year later, in a big English translation, and I'm going to be reviewing it for the Christian Science market, which is that's great. I did not expect that. I suggested it, of course, but every time I write about Israel, every time anybody writes about Israel, they get deluged with letters, and only about 30% of those letters are in any way rational. So, as a book's editor who experiences that once is not likely to want to invoke it again. Nevertheless, I'm going through this in great detail. I'm reading chunks of it. I'm using other books in my collection. Not today. Today is mainly devoted to this book. I want to not only study it in terms of what it says, but in terms of how it goes about its job. I have to remember, with big books like this, where this is subject driven. I mean, Ben-Gurion is a controversial figure. Israel is a controversial backdrop. This thing, in its historical context, is incredibly controversial. All of that is very tempting. But I have to remember with books like this that my job is also to review the book and the translation. So I will be brushing up my Hebrew just a bit. I will do little bits and pieces. I will also consult with that friend in Tel Aviv to see what kind of a translation this is, at least in the general sense. But I also want to talk about, assuming that Chaim Watzman is doing a good job, assuming that is true, assuming that perhaps there were consultations with the author, I want to know what kind of a book this is. Where do its emphases fall? What, if anything, does it intentionally leave out or soft pedal? I want to assess all of that. I've only read one other Ben-Gurion biography, and how I wish I had it here. I don't. And once upon a time, if I knew that a book like this was on my reviewing horizon, I would just be going to the Brattle every day, and because I would know that the Brattle bookshop would provide that the curious synchronicity of the place would mean that biography, that earlier English language biography, would turn up on the dollar cards, and I would just snap it up, and then I would have the work I need. But I don't currently have that book, and I don't think I'm going to the Brattle anytime soon, so I'm just going to wing it. I'm just going to wing it as is. I could probably go to the library. Actually, now that I think about it, I could go to the library and take you along, now couldn't I? Imagine that. What if I went to the library in search of that earlier Ben-Gurion biography and took you along? How many of you are never going to get to the Boston Public Library? Or maybe I should go to the Athenaeum and take you along there, except they might not have the book. That would be a waste of time. I will contemplate. Well, I will contemplate. There's still plenty of days left for reading Rush Vee-Logs. But anyway, that was the prompt was to read one book in the same spot without moving. There you go. This is what I do all day. I do this, and once every 4 or 5 hours, I will look at the bean and I will say, "Do you feel like maybe taking a stroll?" And sometimes she says yes, and sometimes she says no. Then this is it. And BookTube, if you made your money this way, and you had a beautiful summer day out the window, a little rainy, but with trees and sparrows, and you had the bean right here on the top of the couch with you, and you had this kind of pillow right there, and you had books all around you, I have a feeling you would do the same thing. I really do. I don't think you'd be out bicycling. I could be wrong. But anyway, so that is the Reading Rush Day 2. I want to wholeheartedly recommend, of course, the book essays of Virginia Woolf. The essays that are contained in the Common Reader and the Second Common Reader are a small fraction of the total number of book essays that she did in her career, and they are all incredibly worth reading. I also want to very much recommend Me the People. You're probably not going to see it stacked on a table in your bookstore. I think this comes out later in the month. No, this comes out August 6th, so it comes out in a week, probably on that Tuesday, but I'm not sure, except if you have a really good indie bookstore, then you might see it displayed somewhere, but otherwise you probably have to look for it. So the author is Nadia Urbanati, and I really do recommend the book. It will not be distracted reading. She is a very serious author, and this is a very serious subject, and she gives it the intellectual heft that it deserves. So I found it incredibly enjoyably dense reading. Not so much so for Say No to the Duke, but I loved it anyway. Absolutely loved it anyway. And then Estate at Any Cost, which is a major work of translation for the Republic of Letters in English in 2019, no matter what you think of David Ben-Gurion. And no matter whether or not you're going to read the book, I myself could not possibly have let this go by. Biographies are my favorite kind of book. I'm not going to let a major one go by. So that's it. That is my second day of the Reading Rush. I know you just want me to leave the camera on so that you can just watch this. The bean is, she doesn't like the rain. She really doesn't. It just saps the life right out of her. She'll perk up tomorrow. There's no more rain for the rest of the week. So I will wrap this up for now. But I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.